Welcome to the Charismatic Cheetah podcast, exploring all things supernatural biblically. So this is going to be two parts where I had James Snapp Jr. on, a New Testament scholar, to discuss the quote-unquote long ending of Mark, verses 9 through 20. As you may well know, that's a contested portion of the scripture. Most scholars believe that it's not original, and then there's a minority of scholars who believe it is, and James Snapp is one of those in the minority. So two parts. Part one will be, this is part one that you're watching right now. This is him responding to a few clips from Wes Huff. Everyone knows who Wes Huff is. It'll be a shorter episode, not so deep dive. And then part two will be the deep dive with slideshows and a ton of evidence, tons of evidence. So check this one out and then go over to part two. Part two should be out shortly after this one. So anyway, yeah, let me know what you think in the comments. Also, you want a St. Michael Heiser t-shirt? Let me know. There'll be a link in the description. Anyway, enjoy. Thank you. Please subscribe, like, comment, share, all that good stuff. Thank you. But first off, James, good to meet you. Thanks for coming on the show. Could you just tell people who you are? And, I know you're an author. You've done all kinds of stuff. So tell people who you are, and then we'll get started.
All right. I am James Snapp Jr. I live right now in Franklin, Indiana, USA. I am married to my wife, Myra. We have 3 kids, all adults. We have 2 spotted house cats. And I specialize in the study of New Testament manuscripts. I'm working on an archetype of the Gospels.
Right on. So you're a pretty well-known guy. Actually, I was listening to Mike Winger's video on Mark 16. He also believes it's not original to the text, but thinks it should still be in the Bible. He's kind of has like on a middle ground, but he references you quite a few times actually in that video. So people definitely know who you are, and I'm actually really excited to dive into this. So I'm going to play this. There's a few clips. I have 5 clips. Most of them are pretty short. They're all from Wes Huff's YouTube channel. Hopefully I don't get a YouTube copyright strike, but they're pretty short, and I'm gonna give him credit for his stuff, and I'm gonna play the clip and then kind of talk about his arguments against Mark 16, why it shouldn't be, why he doesn't think it's original to the text, and then let you discuss, counterpoint. Sound good?
Sounds superb.
All right, so here's the first clip where he talks about missing 2 very important, Mark 16, the 8 through 20. These verses, he says, are missing from 2 very important manuscripts, and that's Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus. Also, he says it's missing from older manuscript P45, and does address other parts where there is something going on with the long ending of Mark that the scribes were at least aware of it. So here's a short clip from that.
Wait. It's missing from P45 because P45 is missing all the text from Mark 13, Mark 14, Mark 15, and Mark 16. So when you get to a certain verse in Mark 12, the manuscript just stops. It's been damaged.
Makes sense. It's like a little. It's a very short. It's basically a fragment, right?
It's like a nose.
Right. Okay. So here's that clip.
Mark 16, 9 through 20 is found in nearly every New Testament manuscript and is the single longest textual variant in the New Testament. However, it is missing from 2 very significant manuscripts, Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus. And these are significant because Sinaiticus and Vaticanus are our earliest witnesses to the end of Mark. So we actually have manuscripts of Mark, like P45, that are older than Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, but they don't have this latter half of Mark in particular. It's just missing from these documents.
So it sounds like what he's saying is, and I've heard this from a few different people, is that yes, in the majority of ancient manuscripts and Greek manuscripts, and also other languages too, that the long ending of Mark, quote unquote, I'm going to be using that phrase. I know you disagree with that phrase. I'm just gonna use it for convenience sake. But the quote unquote long ending of Mark is in most of these ancient manuscripts, but it's missing from these 2 very important manuscripts, and just like he just stated, P45 as well. So what would you respond to that?
Well, again, P45 is not really witness for or against Mark 16, 9 through 20. because it doesn't have any text at all from Mark 13, 14, 15, or 16. It is simply like who knows that it is missing all the text after chapter 12. So really, what Wes is dealing with is before 1881, we had the Textus Receptus, which was the basis for the King James in the New Testament. And in all the copies of the Textus Receptus, we have Mark 16:9-20. But when Westcott and Hort came onto the scene in the 1800s with their very influential research, they thought that what we know as the Byzantine text, they believed that that was the product of a recension. In other words, somebody created it by using two previously existing forms of text and combining them, and thus making an altogether new form of text. So because they thought that the Byzantine text came into existence in the 200s, they thought that they could just simply push that aside and go back to either the Alexandrian text or the Western text and get the readings from there to make the original text. Well, they also considered the Western text to be very, very much embellished. So to them, the Alexandrian text was the way to go. And the best representatives of the Alexandrian text are, to them, in 1881, this is before P75 was discovered, they considered Vaticanus and Sinaiticus to be the flagship manuscripts of the Alexandrian text. So when they presented their revision of the New Testament, they said, we need to go with these two manuscripts, and unless there's very strong internal evidence to the contrary, always go with what B, that is Vaticanus, and Aleph, that is Sinaiticus, what these two manuscripts say. So in 1881, although it was called the Revised Version, it's more accurate to call it a replacement version because they replaced the Byzantine text, or the predominantly Byzantine text, with one that was predominantly Alexandrian. So that is why, even though a man named Dean John Bergen protested and wrote books about it, despite his objections in academic circles, the Alexandrian text was very prevalent. By 1904, the British and Foreign Bible Society began to print their base text as being very, very, very similar to what Westcott and Hort had made. So, although we have 1,650 manuscripts that do include Mark 16:9-20, because Vaticanus and Sinaiticus in Mark 16 verse 8, Westcott and Hort's view was these verses are not original. Now, they were overruled in the Committee for Translation, but in the later, after they died, in the first edition of the Revised Standard Version, these 12 verses were not in the text, they were put in a footnote. Well, the Revised Standard Version was not very popular, except among the theological liberals, and so its copyright later on expired. Nobody was printing it anymore. When the ESV came along, they thought, hey, if we can get right to it, we can then use this as the foundation for our version. And so the ESV is basically the echo of its ancestor, the RSV, which is itself an ancestor of the 1881 revised text. Well, revised or replacement. So you have the 1881 revised version, then 20 years later, the American Standard Version, and then later on, the RSV. And that, of course, is the ancestor of both the ESV and the new Revised Standard Version. So that gives you some idea of how much our modern text depend on Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, but they also depend on ignoring the body that is called, the body of text called the Byzantine text, which is usually in most cases, between Matthew and Jude, over 85% of manuscripts, usually much higher.
Why do you think they put so much weight? I mean, from what I understand, and I'm no expert on this by any means, but I am fascinated by the whole subject. I think it's important we have these conversations, but I'm no expert. I'm very novice when it comes to textual criticism. So I'm grateful for people like you, and also Dwayne Green, who's kind of simplifies it for people like myself who aren't experts. But I mean, from what I understand, the reason so much weight is placed on those two manuscripts is because are they are they our oldest complete set of the New Testament, or like what's the reasoning behind putting so much weight on two manuscripts when you have, like you said, would you say over 1,000 that have the quote unquote long ending of Mark in it? Like, why is there so much weight placed on those two manuscripts, do you think?
Well, based on my count, the number with Mark 16:20 is 1,653. Now, since then, more have been found and added to that, but that's a good round number to easy to remember. 1,650. But I believe that they are fixated on Vaticanus because it is the best manuscript of the Alexandrian text. And if you walk through Hort's introduction, he presents his theory very thoroughly, and in the 1800s, it was very persuasive. There were simply questions about, well, wait a minute, what about the Syriac Peshitta? And what about the quotations of Ephraim? These were questions in the background that only a few scholars were skilled enough in Europe at the time to really dive into. And there was debate among them. So there was a I wouldn't say a well-known debate, but an important debate in 1894 called the Oxford Debate on New Testament Textual Criticism, where these questions came to the forefront, and Edward Miller engaged some of the sponsors or advocates of the revised text. He was on the side of the Byzantine text. He and Bergen had said, we all know the revised text needs to be revised. I mean, no, sorry, back it up. We all know that the text of Receptus needs to be revised, but now is not the time to do it. We don't have enough resources. We need to collate more manuscripts. We need to analyze the lectionaries. All the authors' books need to be collected and redone. So Bergen wanted to revise the text. He just said, now's not the time. If you do it now, you'll just mess it up. Let's go slow. Let's wait. Let's make it cumulative. Let's make it ecclesiastically approved. Let's not rush into things. But yes, the text does need to be revised, but not the way Hort and Westcott are doing it. So if they followed Bergen, then they would have had to wait. But because they said, no, we can do it now. Well, that's how we got into the mess we're in. We have half the churches following the Byzantine text, or the mostly Byzantine text, the TR, and some with the Byzantine text, and then with all the rest following the Alexandrian text, which is basically what the ESV, NIV, NLT, New Revised are following. Now, there is a version out there called the Evangelical Heritage Translation, which I would say approximates pretty closely to what Bergen would have envisioned. It takes into account the findings that have been made in the past 50 years.
What's it called again? Could you
The Evangelical Heritage Version, EHV.
So it sounds like something happened. I don't know. To me, it sounds like almost kind of like a power move happened a couple centuries ago, and also a lack of, modern scholarship obviously has made leaps and bounds than it has, over the last 100 years. But it sounds like it sounds to me like a kind of a power move happened, and Also, that on top of not having the right resources to really dive into these different, ancient manuscripts and stuff like that. Am I misunderstanding that, or is that about right?
Oh, well, the theory of Westcott Hort, for a lot of people, it was persuasive. Like a Kenyon, he thought, well, yes, there's a lot of hypothesis involved, but what there is makes sense. These are logical hypotheses. And when Burkitt, in 1904, published his analysis of Ephraim, he said, Ephraim, in his gospel quotations, doesn't really use the Peshitta. He uses the old uh, Ditesteron, the Syriac Ditesteron. So when he published those findings in 1904, that took away the thing that the pro-Byzantine supporters had always fallen back on. So now there was nothing in the way to keep the Alexandrian snowball from steamrolling and growing into a big avalanche. So by 1920, I would say, the Alexandrian text was dominant, and it was being printed, and they were preparing to make more translations based on it. Although um, the revised version, the English revised version, and the American Standard Version in 1901, those kind of fell on the wayside, although they were highly promoted. There were like newspapers that were all, here's this great Bible, made by our best scholars. But people didn't like it. They just didn't like the way it sounded. They were used to the vowels. Now, now, we often think of the vowels in our King James being obscure, but the hold on, I have an RB here. And lo and behold, they were still using thee and thou in 1881 in this printed Bible. So those were the thing that was causing any trouble in England. They knew what those words meant. It was simply the high formal English that was the way you translated. It wasn't the way you talked, it was the way you spoke. But when you translated from Greek, these were the precise terms to make the translation you were reading from as precise as possible. So we sometimes we like to get lazy and say, "Oh yeah, we'll just use message because everybody likes a slang. We like to be vernacular." But when scholars want to talk about what God has said, what God has inspired, they like to be as precise as you can.
Right. No, absolutely, absolutely. Okay. So, and I mean, so something that Huff mentions in, and I think this is a really good argument on your end. Maybe we can dive into it a little bit. Is he mentions that there is definitely something quote unquote going on at the end of Mark's gospel. There's a space. There's a large space, and every other gospel doesn't have that space, so it just goes on right to the next book. If I'm understanding the argument correctly. So the way he says it is basically like there was something going on. There was these long endings of Mark circulating at the time of these two, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. So there's definitely something going on. They were at least aware of the quote unquote long ending of Mark. But you've made an argument, and I really like this argument, where you basically took it out and sketched it and said that like the long ending of Mark fits in that space perfectly. Could you go into that? Is there any slides on that that you sent?
Yes, those slides of that. Now, I wouldn't say perfectly. I would say very close. It's the blank space in Vaticanus is obviously memorial space. And memorial space doesn't have to be exact. It just has to be enough. Because scribes knew how to compress the lettering. If you look at the cancel sheets of Sinaiticus, you can see a scribe using quite a bit of compression to make more letters fit on the column than he would naturally have put there. So having it be more or less, that's fine. There's no obstacle at all. But it is a very close fit.
So let me move on to this next clip where I thought this was a really good argument. This is more internal evidence, I suppose, that he brings up. He talks about the style of Greek in the long ending of Mark. Again, I'm still using that term. I know you don't like that term, but just keeping it convenient. But so if you're ready, I'll play this second clip. It's about a minute long, and he talks about the style of Greek. I guess this is the biggest question I have is how to counter this, because this to me is a really good argument. The style of Greek isn't quote unquote natural and is different, and he talks about how it amalgamates from Luke. Let me go ahead and throw that clip up real quick.
Minimum, what we have with the longer ending communicates a style, syntax, grammar, and content which does not fit either Mark's gospel as a whole or even just leading up to the ending of Mark. The Greek in 16:9 through 20 is quite different, somewhat awkwardly reintroduces Mary Magdalene, who has already appeared 3 times in the latter sections of Mark, and it seems to draw a particular style and content from Luke's gospel. And this has been noted by multiple scholars over the years. For example, the appearance of 2 people walking in the country parallels, the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24, the appearance of the 11 while reclining from Luke 24, 36 to 43, and the ascension looks like Luke 24:50 to 51. And this is what textual scholars call a syncretizing feature, in that later scribes, potentially surprised by the abrupt nature of the ending of Mark's gospel at 16:8, which has the women at the tomb afraid, and it says that they didn't tell anyone, then attempt to amalgamate content from Luke.
So how would you respond to that idea of later scribes, because Mark ends really awkwardly, and the women were afraid. We don't even hear from Jesus, the risen Christ in Mark's gospel. It just suddenly ends, and we're going to get into, he talks about the idea of, it ends in the Greek word gar, which is basically 4, and that's really awkward too. He basically, the argument is that later scribes were kind of like freaked out basically by this sudden abrupt ending of Mark's gospel, and that it just suddenly stopped, and basically in the middle of a sentence is kind of how I understand it. And so
there are a number of assumptions though built into some of Wes's statements that we're going to unpack here.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Well, first, when Wes says, or when he said that there's this amalgamation of Luke, Mark was there on the scene too in the book of Acts. So, and he was there in Jerusalem. So was Jesus' uncle, Cleopas. Now, Luke, writing his gospel, goes to the same sources. He goes to Cleopas. In Luke, you have quite a detailed account of the walk toward Emmaus, how Christ is at first a stranger, and they walk along the way. They're sad. He talks with them. They say, come stay with us. They do. There's quite a lengthy pericope in Luke 24 about this. In Mark 16, the whole account of those on the road to Emmaus, it begins and ends within 2 verses. So having Luke's big account and seeing Mark 16's small account, having these 2 things just assumed to be a literary connection, I think is a wild fantasy of Wes. I don't think there's any evidence that this was a literary connection. This is a connection to the same true tradition. And when it comes to the same true tradition, that's something you can say about practically any place where you have in the Gospel of Mark, and the Gospel of Luke, where they say the same thing and they're describing the same events.
Yeah.
Like over 50% of Luke, you also find in Mark. So why Wes wants to say, this was a later scribe doing this, that's simply Wes wanting to posit a scribe doing it instead of somebody else.
And what about the awkward addition of Mary Magdalene at the end? What would you say about that? Same thing?
Well, 2 things. First of all, about Mary herself, Mary is Jesus' mother. According to the writer Pseudo Cyril. Now, if you go to my website, to the blog, the Text of the Gospels, and search for Pseudo Cyril, I have a pretty thorough review of the things that he wrote. One of the things he wrote was that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was from Magdala. So there were two women named Mary from Magdala. So if you're going to say Mary Magdalene, knowing that you already said Mary Magdalene as in the one that was the woman who helped in the ministry, but if you're going to say Mary from Magdala, well, that could be Mary the mother of Jesus, or it could be the other Mary. So then you say, okay, to make it clear which one, I will say the one from whom Jesus cast out 7 demons. Because obviously, Mary, the mother of Jesus, never had any demons. So there's a reason why a fuller explanation would come, or would be appropriate in this at this point, because you might think that Mary, the mother of Jesus, would also come to the tomb. To be clear, I want to. It might be easier if I were to present my theory of what happened to explain the evidence. I think it fits both the external and the internal evidence very well, which is that my deduction is that when Mark wrote many things in Rome, he had been in Rome with Peter helping out as his secretary, amanuensis, and the more a preacher preaches, the longer he gets. So you have Peter preaching and Mark writing it down. You have other people borrowing Mark notes. You have Matthew using many of the same traditions. You have over 90% of what we have in Mark's gospel is also found in Matthew. So clearly, if you go with the synoptic problem theory solution that says Mark wrote first, then you have Matthew using a source that was very, very similar to the Gospel of Mark. But what happened to Mark at the end? Well, you don't really want to say this is the final version until after your source has said that's the final version. Well, in Rome, before Peter could get to the point of saying this is the final version, persecution arose, and Peter and Paul were both killed. And the Romans, being very good at what they do, would want to not only kill the leaders, but also anything that they wrote. So the Gospel of Mark was seen as the memoirs of Peter, so they might want to go after that too. Meanwhile, Mark himself hightails it out of Rome. Mark gets on a boat and goes to Egypt, leaving the church with his unfinished gospel. So the church community in Rome had a choice. Shall we publish the gospel as it is, leading up to verse 8 of chapter 16? Or is there we have another option? Well, they went with another option because Mark already had written a brief summary of the resurrection appearances of Christ, which the church would use at Easter time when they celebrated his resurrection. So instead of having the gospel end at verse 8, they said, let's use this, but also use this other Markan composition, have it be the conclusion, not adding or taking away anything, but simply putting the two things Mark has written together. And then, after that was done, then and only then did they begin to make copies of the Gospel of Mark. And that's the form in which the church first circulated the Gospel of Mark in Rome. And from there, it spread. It was known, wherever it went, it was known to have those 12 verses, except in Egypt. So when we have this, what Manuscript would call, and the inconsistencies of Mark 16:9-20, he would say, well, yes, you have Mary Magdalene being reintroduced. You also have the date and time being redrawn. So it's like the spotlight was on Mary, it was on the tomb there. But the last time we saw Mary Magdalene, she was with her companions. When we see her in verse 9, it's just her. Where'd her two buddies go? So there are these things where they don't match up. But rather than add to the Word of God, the people who were left to put the gospel together and issue it to the church, they simply said, we'll take it as it is and add nothing to it. So with verse 9 to 20, that was altogether the way the church issued the gospel.
So essentially, Mark didn't finish because he was a companion of Peter. He was basically Peter's translator. Essentially, we know that from one of the church fathers. I can't think of his name right now. When Peter and Paul got martyred in Rome, Mark basically fled to Alexandria. And then, so he left his incomplete gospel, his incomplete record of basically Peter's eyewitness testimony of Jesus and his acts. He leaves that in Rome and he goes to Alexandria. And is it in Alexandria? Is that where he completes, or maybe not completes isn't the right word, but he writes a summary of the resurrection? And that is later added to, or am I understanding that correctly?
That's not impossible, but I think that what the Romans did was they had Mark's gospel up to verse 8 of chapter 16. They also had another composition that Mark had already written for a different purpose. That was Christ's resurrection appearances. They simply put the big Markan composition and the small Markan composition together. And in that form, that's how the gospel was issued.
Gotcha. And that would explain why we have two I guess the textual variant there, right? Because certain people were maybe copying the incomplete version of it, and some scribes were copying the version where they basically kind of merge them together. So it's not necessarily original to Mark's gospel. It's original to Mark. Mark wrote both sections, but it's not original to Mark's gospel. Am I hearing that correctly?
Well, I would say it is original. It's authentic. But when we say original, it's like, how precise do you want to be? Because some folks, they would be like, well, one book, one author. Each book has one author. We're not going to say two authors.
Yeah.
But in real life, we do have books of the Bible with more than one author. We have books of the Bible where we don't know the author. We have the Hebrews, who are Hebrews. Most of them say Paul, but not everybody. We have Deuteronomy, where we have, at the end, Moses dies, and then there's some more verses. We have Joshua, where Joshua dies, and then some more. We have Psalms, obviously not all by one author. We have Proverbs in chapter 30, Lemuel, in 31, not Solomon. And yet all these are accepted as canonical and authoritative. So having redactors in the equation has never been a problem for the church. But the church has always said, the form in which it is first issued is what matters. If the church issues a book, then the question of, I think Bergen put it this way, he would say, the question is not who wrote it, the question is, in the ancestor of all manuscripts, was it there or was it not there? If it's there, then it is considered part of the original. I like that.
Yeah, I like that too, to be honest with you. Okay, that I like that. I like that. Makes a lot of sense. So, and we're already at 35 minutes, which is nuts.
Well, we gotta get to the slides.
Yeah, we gotta get to the slides. So let's go ahead and do that. Actually, one more thing I want to, one more clip I want to play real quick. Is where he basically refers to it ending in the word gar, and he explains that essentially that Plato's Republic, it ends in gar as well, and that's not considered, it's not awkward for him to end there. Let me play this clip real quick. I'll let you respond to that, and then we'll go into the slides. Sound good?
Well, I don't have my copy of Plato handy, but so I have no way to test his claim one way or the other right now.
And one of the arguments that is discussed is that the gospel in Greek ends with the conjunction gar, which in English we translate as for. Now, it has often been thought that this is unlikely that a book would end with the word for. It just is awkward grammatically, and that's true. Like, you wouldn't end a sentence in English with the word for, and you also, although word order is less important in Greek, it's still kind of messy to end with the word gar in Greek. For anyone who's overall familiar with Mark's writing style in Greek, he's not exactly hugely eloquent anyways. And we do actually have precedent in both Koine Greek and Classical Greek with documents ending in for. In fact, Plato actually ends his work, The Republic, with gar as the last word of a book, as he concludes the dialogue of Socrates' statements about the afterlife and the reward for living a just life. So it's not entirely out of the realm of possibility.
Well, first, again, I can't test that statement right now. I would like to, if I don't have time to do it on the spot. Now, as far as I know, there's in my book, The Authentication Mark 1620, I walk through each one of the proposed, this one does it, and this one does it. Well, these are compositions that are not narratives. These are speeches. And there's a difference between ending a speech in gar than a narrative. If Mark ended in gar, it was the first, his gospel would have been the first ever narrative to end in gar in that way. Mark himself, if you look at the way he uses gar throughout the rest of his gospel, he never ends it like this. We don't see it. And again, in terms of style, if we're going to appeal to style, then consider that the style of Mark 69 in the way it does is very much unlike Mark's manners of writing. So the stylistic evidence is not all pointing in one direction, and I go into that in my book. By the way, if anybody can't afford a copy of my book, email me at james.snapp@gmail.com. I'll send you a copy for free. But also, in terms of vocabulary, Wes is probably simply parroting some things that he read from Bruce Metzger that he read from Dan Wallace that Dan got from Bruce Metzger, where Metzger was trying to make a case against the against Mark 16:19-20 as part of the original text, where he said, these 12 verses, there's so many vocabulary words that are not like Mark. Well, what Metzger failed to do was he never did say, well, what's the baseline? Is the baseline 0? Well, how many once used words could Mark use in 12 verses? Well, a friend of mine, who I've never met, but the Kareem Hanafi, he has broken down all the Gospel Mark into 12 verse segments. He found there are at least 8 other 12 verse segments that have more once used words than Mark 16-20. So if you're simply going to use the vocabulary words as evidence that, Mark couldn't have written this passage, then what do you do with these other 12 verse segments where there are more once used words than you have in Mark 16-20? Metzger was simply picking and choosing what he thought would be considered persuasive. In other words, you're not reading in Metzger an even-handed, objective presentation of evidence. You're reading evidence that is designed to point you toward a certain conclusion. We call that propaganda.
Yeah, that's so true. Well, okay, so I guess we'll wrap up the Wes Huff response. I had a couple more clips, but I really do want to get into these slides. I think that's really where the meat's gonna be. What I might do is I might break this into 2 different episodes: the respond to Wes Huff episode and the slideshow presentation or whatever episode. That concludes part 1 of my conversation with James Snapp. I apologize. It wasn't planned on being 2-part episode. So if you enjoyed this part 2, if you don't already see it up on the screen, that means it's not out yet. But if it's not out yet, it will be soon. So thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, comment, share, all that good stuff. If you like Michael Heiser and you want a St. Michael Heiser t-shirt, link will be in the description. Thank you.